Okay, welcome to the second Jewish Values Online video. Today we are going to be talking about the pending circumcision ban introduced in San Francisco. The Bay Area has long been ahead of its time, and it's challenging the larger culture in a new and controversial way. In November, there's going to be a referendum that would be the first referendum against circumcision in the U.S. What entertains me most about this entire debate, and I do have to say entertains, is the wonderful copywriting of the activists that call themselves intactivists. I think it's the loveliest bit of copywriting that I've heard in a long time. Let me introduce our panelists first. We have Rabbi Joe Blair, who was born in New York City and raised in Fairfax, North Virginia, and is currently the administrative director of Jewish Values Online. Served as a director of Hill at Duke University. Rabbi Blair, what's your most recent pulpit?
I'm currently serving two small congregations in the Shenandoah Valley, one in Stanton and one in Harrisonburg.
And Rabbi Blair is our reform panelist. Rabbi Alana Suskin is our conservative panelist. You are a senior managing editor at Jew School. You are also an educator and writer who's been published in such publications as Lilith and Shema. Our Orthodox panelist is Rabbi Michael Mordechai Rakos, Associate University Chaplain for the Jewish Community of Brown University, Hillel. Okay, rabbis, let's talk about the main issues with the circumcision ban. We have tradition, both secular tradition in terms of more than 50% of the population currently being circumcised, and we have human rights. Let's say the argument of not doing something to a kid against his will. Let us start with Rabbi Blair. How do you see the larger issue of human rights and doing something to a child in terms of reconciling that with tradition?
I will leave the discussion of tradition to my colleagues. I think they'll go into it in more detail. But in terms of the issue of human rights, I don't see this as a concern. Frankly, I find this debate to be specious. The reality is there's too much in terms of non-religious argumentation in favor of circumcision to not support it. So that's just basically the position I take right off the bat. And again, I'll leave the others to talk about the religious issue.
Can you tell me? Can you give me some examples of the non-religious argumentation that you support?
Sure. Very clearly, I am highly in favor of the fact that this procedure seems to have a great deal to do with the number of infections and health issues for the person long term, that it has connections to reduction of transmission of HIV/AIDS by some 60% in environments where that's highly relevant. And it also seems to drop the incidence of cervical cancer among the partners of persons who are circumcised by approximately 30%.
Okay. Rabbi Suskin, do you want to speak to those health issues as opposed to the tradition or the halacha or whatever we want to call it in this forum, or do you want to talk about
Well,
something else?
sure. I mean, in terms of health issues, honestly, I think that the data is really not all that clear. And as a result, I don't think that I would even consider bringing that in as an argument for why one should get circumcised if one's a Jew. And in fact, I'm not entirely sure that if one isn't Jewish or Muslim, that one should consider circumcising. I'm not sure that there's enough data in favor of it. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, there's an argument in the Talmud in Sanhedrin, and it talks about why many biblical laws weren't discussed in the Torah itself. And it says that there are specific cases where it was, and it says in 2 verses there were reasons revealed, and they actually caused the greatest king in the world to stumble. They're referring to Shlomo HaMelech. In the Torah, it says you shouldn't multiply one's wives, and Solomon says, well, I'll multiply wives, but my heart won't be perverted. And it says, nevertheless, when he got old, his wives did pervert his heart. And then also it says that he one shouldn't multiply horses for themselves. And Solomon said, well, I'm going to multiply horses for myself, but I won't cause Israel to return to Egypt. And yet it says in the Torah, a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver. So the Talmud itself really doesn't want us to rely, or our tradition doesn't want us to rely on, these secular reasons for doing a mitzvah. Now, there may be other.
And yet, we have to deal with the reality that we do have to speak in terms of, we have to use the same
Indeed.
language. In other words, okay, so let me go over to Rabbi Rackover for a minute. How can we, using the language of the debate in question in terms of First Amendment rights and the rights of the child, reconcile it with our tradition while still talking traditionally? You think there's a way?
I think I'm going to answer your question, but you'll tell me if I don't, and you'll ask it again. I think a number of things have come up. The first one is the question of human rights and what are the rights of a child. Now, this is a very dangerous territory because it encroaches upon the question of what the rights of a fetus are, and in general, what human rights are and how do we define them. And not to say that children don't have rights, but there are many things that we do to our children that they don't consent to. I've given my children a number of inoculations. I've held them down for stitches. I didn't get a signed document from them that said it was okay. Now there's a clear and obvious, the examples I use are clear and obviously they're beneficial to the child, even if the child can't recognize them at the time. I don't want to transpose that directly onto circumcision, but I want to say in general, we have a problem of delineating the rights of the child and the values of the parent, and how do we separate those out? It's not so simple. I don't think that health reasons, the second issue that came up, are actually secular reasons. Just to put a finer point on the language, if you want to talk about, Torah values, it's true that it says you should circumcise because God said so, and there's a covenant, and it's called the Brit Milah. But the Torah value, Shmarta me'od nafshotechem, you'll verily guard yourself, your soul. You'll take care of yourself, as understood rabbinically and throughout tradition, and I would imagine in all denominations, to mean that you have an obligation to heal yourself and to make yourself proactively healthy. So if there's even a 50% chance or a 60% chance that something would be healthful, then we should not only investigate it and work on it, we should also non-Jews. If we let go of that, then we take health away from being a religious issue, and health really is a religious question as well. Traditional conversation, those are traditional conversations, what we just had. If there's more that I could explicate on that question, I'd be happy to.
The argument that I was thinking of, and tell me if this is Jewish rabbinic thinking, elective surgery in general. I imagine that the community in San Francisco who is advocating against circumcision may be pierced and tattooed. So I'm wondering at what point, or augmented in various ways, what do you think is the fine point on their argument against circumcision, but that would allow them to get a piercing or a tattoo, or even pierce their little girl's ears when she's born? In other words, do you think there's an actual argument there, or do you think that it is actually specious, like you said, Rabbi Blair, and capricious, and that in which case there's an edge here to this argument that might be a little ugly?
Could I just ask a quick question, because you seem to be saying that people who are tattooed and piercing are simultaneously the ones who aren't getting circumcised? Is that what you're asking?
I'm wondering if everybody of the intactivists would pierce a child's ears, and I would never go for elective surgery.
I think we have to be fairer to them. I may not agree with them, but I still can understand the perspective. It's called genital mutilation when we do it to the fairer sex, as they once said. But when we do it to a boy, it's some kind of religious cosmetic surgery, and therefore it's not offensive. That doesn't make any sense. So if we take a gender neutral perspective on this, we say, well, this is really a bad thing to do to anybody. It doesn't grow back. Whereas if I pierce my ears or my nipples or my nose, all of those things are basically, this little girl can opt at a later point in life to say, I don't want to wear earrings. She may have a little hole, but as she gets older, it'll probably close up. So I don't think it's fair for us to commingle these conversations about tattooing and things like that. The other thing is that I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but there's no choice, right? If I'm 8, you cannot get a tattoo in most states until you're 18. You can't have your ears pierced until you're a certain age unless your parents come with you and things like this. But an 8-day-old baby, again, he's not signing the consent form. And I think that's one of the major issues, because you grow up and suddenly you don't have a foreskin. Oh, who knew? And then you find that your sexual drive is different.
What you're saying is you are ice the body thing. In other words, the mutilation, let's say I feel that getting a tattoo is mutilating yourself. You have the right to mutilate yourself, right? We're talking about the baby. I just want to isolate it in terms of, because I don't think it matters where on your body you do it. I don't think that's the discussion. And it's obviously not a mutilation question, because I haven't heard anyone advocating against other forms of self-mutilation. It seems to be a doing something to a child without their consent issue, unless I'm not understanding the finer points. Rabbi Blair?
The quick analogy that I would suggest is not going to the child, but to the individual. We don't seem to have any concerns with breast enhancement or breast reduction surgery. We don't have any problem with nose jobs. We don't have any problem with other kinds of cosmetic surgeries. This seems to be a flashpoint on two counts, frankly. One, that it has to do with issues of sexuality, and two, that for some reason it's being singled out because it is limited to a certain segment of the population that have beliefs in a particular area. So I would say that there may be, at least among some of those that you're identifying as intactivists, less than honorable motivations. Despite Rabbi Rackover's comment that we have to be fair to them, I think you can be fair to them negatively. So as far as the child, the issue of having a child that is being acted on in this fashion, it's the same thing as Rabbi Rackover said earlier with giving them injections for vaccinations and so on. I don't see that it's really an issue. It's a matter of dealing with their health and their well-being long term.
Okay, Rabbi Susskind?
So, first of all, there's so many things to address here. First of all, you had said earlier that you believe that the intactivists don't have an issue to oneself, or perhaps even a child who does something to themselves. So you mentioned tattooing and piercing as specific examples. Rabbi Blair mentioned, breast reduction or enhancement, or, other things of that nature. And it's interesting that those get brought up, because I think all of those are very much, they are things that actually in Judaism, in Jewish tradition, are not actually permitted. Jewish tradition says pretty clearly that our bodies are not our own to do with as we will. And so when we make alterations to our bodies, the reason that piercing is okay where tattooing and other kinds of elective surgery aren't, it's actually outside of that. So maybe that would be an interesting comparison with the Brit Milah, with the circumcision. But in general, elective surgery is really frowned upon in Judaism if it's only for the sake of vanity, which tattooing and breast augmentation as a rule pretty much are. And there's extensive modern literature about people discussing this. And Rabbi Feinstein, a generation ago, said that it is permitted under certain circumstances. There's a great deal of argument about when it's permitted, but it's very, very limited. And it's limited specifically to cases where it's not simply an issue of vanity, but perhaps about when you went out in public because your appearance was so extreme. And I think that that's something to consider when we think about what it is we're talking about here, which is that we're not really talking about, in Judaism at least, we're not really talking about what we're allowed to do to our own bodies, because we're not the ultimate arbiter of what that is. Our bodies in general belong to God.
Well, that's a very interesting thing, because that's almost exactly the opposite of what the intactivists are saying, that our bodies belong to ourselves, even to the point of it belonging to myself as a little baby. And then where you draw the line with that is interesting.